Marta Shepherd's research, which explores therapists' experiences of countertransference, won the CPCAB Counselling Research Award for 2016. Counsellor and psychotherapist Barry Kopp met Marta in Winchester to discuss her work.
It's a pleasure to welcome Marta Shepherd here today, who received the CPCAB 2016 Research Award for her research entitled "It's Like I'm Sitting in Front of Myself, an exploration of therapists' experience of countertransference when working with parallel client issues." And I'm wondering perhaps what brought you to this particular research.
It was a situation that happened to me when I was in my first year of practice. I was a trainee still back then, and my client talked about something that was very similar to what had happened to me. And in the session I could sort of feel, the emotions coming back that I once felt when going through the experience. And it was, I felt a strong empathy for the client, a deep connection. So it was a big surprise when after that session, the client left therapy prematurely. It made me reflect back on that session, what actually happened. I was able to talk to my supervisor openly about, the possibility whether, my personal issues in a way contaminated that, therapeutic space at that time. It just made me realise I hadn't been prepared at all for a situation like that, and just came up with the idea that it would be a good subject to research and to find out more about it.
Mm-hmm. And that sounds quite interesting to me that, one of the things perhaps you're saying there is, I was experiencing empathy for this client, but I'm wondering if you're also saying, actually, was this my stuff I was experiencing or the client stuff I was experiencing? And somehow in the training we weren't prepared to maybe detach that in some way or to recognise what that difference is, or
yes, like in countertransference, to be able to separate what's mine and what's the client's, and for what for me was experience of a deep connection, perhaps for the client the experience was completely different. What they left after also. Mm-hmm.
And again, I'm wondering, who am I connecting with, the client or with my own experience at that point? And you use the term there, countertransference, and that's sort of quite a technical term in some ways, and I wonder what your meaning is of countertransference.
Well, it refers to any reaction that a therapist can have in relation to the work with a client. So it could be any feeling or a thought, behaviour. It could be a physical response as well. It could be dreams. So it's really sort of anything that a therapist can notice about themselves in relation to the client.
So sort of quite a broad term for anything that I may experience about the client.
Yes, yes, that's right. And the understanding of its meaning and significance, I guess, it varies across the modalities.
Okay, thank you. So you decided to do some research into this. So did you contact other participants, or how did you go around researching this?
I contacted, I think, in total about 400 practitioners. So I first contacted some through BACP website. I also went on Hampshire Association for Counselling and Psychotherapy, and similar organisation that's in Dorset. And when I went to any CPD event, I did take some flyers with me to also try to encourage participants to get back to me.
So out of the 400, how many?
11.
11, that's quite a good number.
It's not too bad. Yeah, it wasn't too bad, but actually 2 out of those 11 then dropped out. One participant didn't feel comfortable with being audio recorded, and the other just sort of the contact just sort of stopped. So I ended up with nine counsellors.
And these were based on interviews with the counsellors?
Yes, so I had semi-structured interviews. They were audio recorded, about half an hour long.
And could you tell us a little bit maybe about what the focus of those interviews was?
Well, the focus was the experience of the countertransference in the room, the parallel between the therapist and the client, and what was it like for the therapists, what they felt and how they coped with it as well.
Mm-hmm. And what were the results of that, or the outcome from that research?
Well, my participants reported feelings of anxiety. They found the experience very intense. Some felt sort of suddenly being taken back to their own personal issue. Some felt disconnected from the client, and some felt very identified with the client and very emotionally engaged with them, trying to help, wanting to help, feeling the sort of the strong pull to do something and feeling very strong connection.
Almost wanting to rescue the client, maybe.
Yes,
in some way.
Yes, absolutely. But for all the participants, there was a quite significant emotional impact during the session and after the session. It just sort of stayed with them in a way. It was difficult to cope with it.
I'm wondering what that staying with them was. Was that the client's issue staying with them, or the issue that it raised for them?
Well, I guess that's the tricky part, isn't it? Because that's it's about separate what belongs to the therapist and what belongs to the client. But the effect of that, the impact on the therapist was quite significant, emotionally.
And I wonder also how that impacts on their work with that client.
Well, that was the issue that was a bit, it wasn't explored perhaps deeply enough. Most participants weren't sure. They felt there wasn't too much impact on the process or on the client. There was nothing. There was really they noticed. There was sort of standing out. Some reported being a bit less boundaried with the client, more lenient because they sort of over-identified with what the client was going through. And those who felt disconnected had obviously also felt anxious and guilty about it, and really tried to really worked hard to reconnect with the client, to get back into the basic counselling skills and to be able to be in the room with the client. But I didn't get too much information in terms of what actually happened to the process and what was the impact. It was just it was more the therapist experience and the little things that they noticed, but it was more about themselves than the impact on the counselling process.
So I guess perhaps part of the thing about the research might be moving into the future, how that might affect my work with the client. But in terms of this research, it was looking more at the effect on the therapist.
Yes. I mean, one of my questions was about the impact on the therapeutic process, but I guess perhaps this was about one of the limitations of the research that I pointed out, which was self-serving bias. It must have been a bit difficult for my participants to actually look back and think, was there any negative impact on the process on the client? They talked more about how they manage the countertransference in the session, try to sort of separate what was theirs, what was the client's, contain the feelings that were brought up for them, and then to reconnect with the client and to use actually their own personal experience to fuel the empathy, to deepen the connection with them.
So I guess I'm hearing that the focus is very much on my experience as a therapist, but unclear of the full impact that may potentially have on the client.
Yes,
and I guess moving forward that might be an interesting avenue to explore.
Yes, definitely. There's an area that could be explored further. Just a few participants, but I was a minority who mentioned, being a bit more lenient towards the client, or the disconnection and worrying about that and how perhaps that impacted the process. But that was a minority of participants.
So something about maybe a looseness in boundaries and not quite being in that space fully present as an initial impact.
Yes, definitely.
So in terms of the therapist and the impact on the therapist, or what was coming out from that for the therapist?
Well, it was the experience of intensity of the feelings. It was some interviewees were quite shocked actually at the return of the personal material that was in most cases had been worked through in personal therapy. So they were quite surprised, and that actually brought to attention this issue of what does it mean to have our issues processed or worked through? Is it actually possible? Is it actually doable? And what does it mean?
And that almost questions the value of what is counselling, isn't it? If I've been through this process myself and it's still hitting me when I'm with my clients, when I thought I've dealt with that one, and it still comes back, it's almost questioning something about the therapeutic process itself.
Yeah, something about the limits of what therapy can achieve, but I guess it's depending on what the goal is.
But there's also something about the surprise that, this issue's come back to me.
Yes. There were some participants who had been in personal therapy for years and have worked through those particular issues that sort of came up in the session for them with that particular client, and they were really surprised and just taken aback really. And that I guess some of those intense emotions and being taken back to their own personal issues also brought feelings of anxiety about their being de-skilled and feeling guilty for not perhaps being with the client the way a counsellor should be.
And that feels important. Something about I'm feeling de-skilled and anxious about, am I able to be here for the client in some way?
Yes. And some of my participants actually talked about about considering a referral, to refer a client onto another practitioner because they felt, they were doubting their ability to work with the client, basically.
Am I good enough for this client?
Yes, and it's quite interesting because there was very little that I could find, very little in literature about referring a client on for this particular reason, and it's interesting. It's interesting because I guess this is something that it's very difficult to admit, perhaps, for a practitioner that actually, sorry, I can't work with this client because for me it just brings some stuff back. So, yeah.
And you mentioned there the literature, so I'm wondering if you're saying that very little research has been done on this.
Yes, there's quite a limited amount of research, yes.
And sort of therefore I'm wondering, is this something that you feel is addressed in training?
I think this is the issue that's not really discussed enough on counselling training courses. I definitely didn't learn how to deal with situations like that, how to deal with working with parallel. So I think this is certainly something that could be taught.
Mm-hmm. So in a sense, there's something about I learn how to work with countertransference, but not necessarily when it's bringing up my own deep-rooted issues.
Yes.
And how do I manage that, and how do I work with that, not only with the client, but to keep myself safe, I guess.
Yes, absolutely, because it's about the welfare of the two people in the room. It's the client and the therapist. So when the therapist is going through an intense emotional experience, it's difficult for them to, it's hard for them, but it's also difficult to stay in their counselling role and be with the client and be available emotionally for them. And I guess it's about, remembering that there's the two people in the room and then both are bringing something into the interaction.
And I guess that sort of reminds me of where we sort of started, where you were talking about empathy. That, therefore, whose experience am I experiencing and working with? Am I working with the client's experience, or am I working with my experience? Or are the two sort of clouded in some way? And and how do we work through that?
Yes, and I guess this is something about also supervision, how often in supervision, we are told, oh, this is something they can take to your personal therapy. But I think when the counsellor's personal issue can impact the therapeutic process, it is important to bring it to supervision and be able to discuss what are the the risks of contamination, basically. And my participants reported, a great helpfulness of supervision and peer support, and also reflective practice, and being able to sit down, write the process notes, think about what actually happened here, and just process it and make sure that they still look after themselves and also look after the client.
So I'm sort of minded when you're saying that there's something maybe about training and looking at how important our self-awareness is, and actually things like our own personal therapy, and really getting to know who we are. That it's not just an adjunct in the training, it's not just an optional extra, it's actually something that's quite crucial, because it can still come up even though we think we've worked with it. Yes. It can re-emerge at some point. But there's also something I think you're saying there about perhaps also having the courage to recognise, actually, am I able to really work with this client at this time with the issues that I'm also experiencing? And maybe not seeing that as a failure in discussing in supervision about, actually, is this possible at the moment, or should I refer this client to someone else?
Yes, and I guess this is very difficult, to think about, isn't it? Actually, to think about the limits of our own skills and, our emotional space for some clients. And I guess, like you're saying, there's self-awareness and the sort of the knowledge of our own blind spots, and to just know where they are and how they can be sort of pressed, and just to be able to work with that. And because after all, our emotional space is what we bring to the room with the client. We make ourselves available and together with our blind spots.
Absolutely.
And that's why we need to know about what happens when they're being pressed.
And we never know what clients are going to trigger for us, I guess.
No, absolutely.
And maybe again you're saying that there's something about in training that we're not being prepared, or we're not preparing students or trainee counsellors for that eventuality, that actually things are triggered and that actually it is part of the process, and actually something about having the courage to recognise ourselves in that process and taking care of ourselves.
And I think it's very important to raise awareness on this particular issue, because I believe it happens to any practitioner. It's just, it's just those kind of things that everyone at some point, to some level, will go through.
And I guess it's part of safe and ethical practice to look after ourselves and care for ourselves as well, and be aware of what's happening for us.
Yes, absolutely.
Well, thank you, Marta. It's been a pleasure talking with you today.
Thank you very much.